All set.
Yeah, good morning. Duncan Krebs is joining us. Wave to the people, Duncan. Duncan is a Middlebury College student who is interning with the Climate Economy Action Center of Addison County, of which I'm a board member. And his job this summer is to update our existing greenhouse gas inventory that was done by another student 2 years ago and bring it up to date, and also perhaps apply some of the lessons we've learned in working on the state inventory. So by the end of the summer, we'll have an updated Addison County inventory.
Excellent.
And
Well,
we're really glad to have Duncan helping us. This is his first week. We're asking him to drink from the fire hose.
fabulous. Terrific. Thanks, Richard, so much. All right, let me share my screen. I gotta get the right thing here. Let's walk through the agenda for today and get started. As you know, Jane's out today. Marion is kindly filling her space. So just a reminder about our protocols. We want to kind of be present and clear with an open mind and open heart. We want to listen generously across differences, ask for what you need, speak your truth while also being aware of how it affects others, and recognize this is a lot of complexity. So what we wanted to do is, Marion, maybe you can report better than I can, but just kind of clarify what the steering committee said about our scope. Let's talk about a little bit of a work plan, so to speak, that you all asked for, I think, smartly last time. And we'll go through kind of the questions that Jane framed up on our kind of scope chart. And we can modify those after today, but we want comment. Then Bill Keaton's going to come back to us at 9. And if you remember, he had kind of a set of recommendations or ideas in one of his last slides that he presented when we had that rich discussion. And he's going to come back, kind of project that up, and we want to talk about that just to see where the group is on those kind of ideas. We thought it was a good way to kind of gel some conversation. It doesn't have to be determinative, but we thought it would be very helpful. And then we'll take public comment and adjourn by 10. So any questions about the agenda for today? Okay. All right. I think, Marion, do we need to approve minutes from last time, or are those just considered kind of done? I don't remember how that works.
We should just quickly review them and approve them. They're not linked, but I can post in the chat. Give me just a moment.
Anybody have any additions or corrections to our notes from the June 1st meeting? Okay, any additions or corrections to the June 1st meeting? All right. Anybody of the working group object to approving them? Okay, we'll consider those approved. Just a quick note for our meeting on the 20th, I think it's the 29th is our next meeting. One of the topics people wanted to cover was air quality. So Jane and I have been trying to kind of round up some folks who can actually present on the air quality from the existing large, electricity producing facilities. So we're identifying, 2 or 3 different people because of different perspectives to help come talk about that. So we'll know more in a little bit when we get confirmation, but just to let you know, that's likely to be our focus on June 29th. And Richard, you had suggested a contact or 2, which was helpful. So we've been reaching out to them. So just an update on that. Okay. So for the steering committee, I think we were trying to clarify what about biofuels that are not woody biomass. And what I believe, what you have in writing is all I know, which is the steering committee agreed to proposal put forward to focus narrowly on woody biomass and electricity generation and other biofuel issues will be considered and delegated by the council when the life cycle analysis is completed. So I think biofuels and sort of non-woody biomass stuff is not within our scope. But Marion, do you have anything to clarify for that? And then I'll go to Judy.
I apologize. I am not going to be very helpful here. I was out and only got back yesterday, so have not spoken to Jade and was not at the steering committee meeting. I'm really only here to help record, so apologies. But if other folks are at the steering committee meeting, they may be more helpful than I am.
Okay, Judy, go ahead.
I was at the steering committee, and I want to walk down the path of how I understand it. So the ag and ecosystem spent 18 months talking about this biofuels biomass. We put in a list of recommendations. They got tabled and a new list got made by this committee. This was presented to the steering committee as our scope. And the steering committee, on the recommendation of Jane, decided to wait 9 to 12 months until the life cycle analysis was completed before they addressed that. And that's how it got left out of our scope. I find that to be very problematic. I find that to kind of be a little bit more like the bottom of the cage the chickens are in, rather than democracy. And I'm concerned that we're waiting 12 months to discuss this.
And Judy, you mean by this biofuels more broadly?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, Liz, were you, I don't know, are you on the steering committee? I don't know if you were there and want to just add anything from your perspective?
Yep, no, I am on the steering committee. I was there, and I supported Jane's recommendation. I didn't see it the way that Judy just articulated it as presented to the steering committee and as understood by me. It was really two things. One was the life cycle analysis and the additional information that will yield on biofuels more generally, as we've discussed in the past. And then secondly, at least for me, and it felt like this came through in the committee meeting, making sure that this subgroup is sort of properly defined and feels good about tackling what we are going to tackle, which is woody biomass, and specifically the issues surrounding the efficient use of woody biomass when it comes to electric generation and any co-uses. So without that sort of, expressly defined scope, I think folks on this subcommittee rightly felt like, well, gee, we shouldn't just be saying we're a biomass subgroup when we're only tackling one aspect of biomass. And so talking with the steering committee and having the scope defined the way that it has been, I think is helpful, because it gives this committee a narrow focus, a specific task, something that feels achievable within the relatively short time period that we have, while, as Judy noted, putting in a different place at a different time after the life cycle is completed, the more general discussion of biofuels and other uses and forms of biomass. I'll stop there.
That's good.
I'd just like to follow up on that comment. Liz, are you sure you did not hear Jane say it would be put on hold for 9 to 12 months until the life cycle analysis was completed?
I'm not sure you and I are disagreeing. I think on the scope of biomass beyond woody biomass, that is what I heard. And it was for the reasons that I articulated a second ago, and it was okay with me at least, and I think other steering committee members for those reasons, but not putting on hold the work that we're doing on the more narrowly and expressly defined set of issues, including those I think that we're discussing today regarding woody biomass, particularly woody biomass used in electric generation or electric lead.
So what I wonder, I mean, we're somewhat at the whatever the words are, the direction of the steering committee for now. I know Judy's concerned about biofuels not doing it sooner than the life cycle analysis will be doing it. I see a comment in chat as well from Annette. So I think at this point, if folks are concerned about the biofuels issue more broadly, I would encourage you to bring to the steering committee, write your letters, send your emails, whatever you need to do to express the concern. And as Annette described, kind of the why. And then, I think the steering committee will have to take that up. But I think for now, we've got kind of a scope and we have a lot to do heading into, as we said, September. So again, I think at this point, the concerns probably need to be raised at the steering committee level about the biofuels point. But it does lead us into our next conversation, which is looking at the scope and the questions we're trying to answer. So want to go there. If we need more follow-up on this next time when Jane was there, we can certainly do that as well.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I've heard and see Annette's comments as well. And yeah, it does seem like, and I think this is how it was presented when the steering committee met, an additional issue, if you want to call it that. And so part of the discussion on whether this was even the proper subgroup to talk about those broader topics, et cetera, I think that's a good follow-up for the steering committee while this group remains focused on the task as it's been defined. Thanks, Patrick.
You bet. Thank you. Thank you all. Okay, so I do want to actually go, and this is going to be, you also look in the link that that Marion put in, because it's a little hard to read online, but bear with me. So I just want to talk about kind of the questions that Jane framed up around the scope. And Marion, are you able to take notes for this part? And then we can make any edits to this or added questions or whatever and get this back to you before next time. So the first one was around, obviously the scope is around the original recommendation from the Ag and Eco Working Group was prohibit the expansion of current and or construction of any new large scale industrial electric generation biomass facilities. And so the question I think Jane kind of put up is, is there a consensus around opposition to future state subsidies to operate either plant, opposition to expansion, opposition to, any future expansion, are we going to focus on new facilities, existing facilities? We might have to debate what expansion means. And then is there a consensus about, broader sort of impacts that might have to do with air quality, cultural, and other? And again, that's something we're going to dive into next meeting in terms of question 2. So I'm just curious if people think that question under kind of existing plants are the right kind of questions, or if you would reframe or add or do something different. Sorry, this is a little hard to read. And those are things obviously we haven't discussed yet, but we would. Any additional questions you'd add? Anything you'd reframe?
So just to clarify, Pat, are you asking, are these the right questions to ask, or are you asking for an answer to the question?
Thank you. No, we're only focused on this is kind of our scope. So we're just trying to frame up the questions. Thanks, Charlie. So we're not asking for an answer to this. We'll look for the answer in discussion later. This is just to clarify our scope and for you guys to ask for kind of be more specific. So these are the questions we thought the group has to wrestle with. So are these the right questions? Thanks, Charlie, for that. Good point. Richard. Richard, you're on mute there.
You can probably hear me better when I'm not muted. It has seemed to me important to consider effects of burning woody biomass for electricity or for home heat, but we're focused on electricity right now. In terms of the public health impact, the air quality impact. And so this statement here that we've been working from is focused on the impact on forests and on the amount of stored carbon that we have. But it seems to me that's a somewhat limited perspective, and I've suggested that we should ask Jared Ulmer from the Vermont Department of Health to come and talk to us about the air quality issues, or somebody from ANR or both.
And we have already reached out to Jared Richard for June 29th. So we've got, I think he's on T to come help us out.
Good. And that's great. I'm glad to hear that. I didn't know that, but I'm just worried that the framing of the question in this document is very narrow.
I wonder if we could say something about considering GHG emissions, potential benefits of fried forest land, and associated other impacts like public health, air quality, et cetera. And then we can list out our questions.
No, that's fine. I just didn't want to exclude those considerations.
Nope, that's good advice. It's good. Megan, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to point out that in reaching out to Jared, I think he explained that he could speak to air quality issues related to wood burning, but that his expertise didn't necessarily lie in speaking about emissions from electric generation from biomass specifically. And so I think we still do need to acknowledge that, that we may need, additional expertise in that arena. And I think that's important because when we're talking about air quality and emissions from electric generation, from biomass, those facilities usually have very specific and sophisticated controls on them. And so I appreciate Adam's suggestion of maybe inviting John Hinckley to speak, because John is a consultant that works quite frequently with permitted air facilities in the state of Vermont. And I'm honestly not sure if he's consulted with the McNeil or Rygate facility specifically, but he could probably speak to the particular controls and how those impact emissions from these facilities. So I just wanted to note that, while I think Jared will be very helpful, there is likely additional expertise that we need to hear from.
And so Megan, I think that's what Jared said back to us. So we were trying to identify, maybe with your help, who that other person or people are. We mentioned potentially NESCOM, because they have some broader regional perspective, and then maybe the consultant just put in the chat is useful too.
Yeah, I mean, NESCOM is a really helpful resource as well. They, folks at NESCOM also, I think, have lately at least had more of a focus on the residential and the industrial, commercial, and institutional types of appliances that burn biomass. So that could be in addition to Jared. In particular, I think NESCOM might have some helpful information about, the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of, EPA's certification program on those types of appliances. But I do think Adam's suggestion of reaching out to John Hinckley is helpful, and I'm happy to help facilitate that, since the Air Division works really closely with John pretty frequently in terms of our permitted facilities.
Megan, that would be great. And then Jana will follow up when she's back next week. Marion, I think she's back next week, right, Marion?
She's back at the end of next week, 2 weeks.
Okay. Marion, maybe we can work with Megan to kind of get this in line for
Sure.
Is that okay? Okay, so that's great, Megan. Thanks a lot. But you're back to you then, to Charlie.
Yeah, I appreciate that Jared Ulmer is being cautious and doesn't want to get beyond his own expertise. I just would point out that the effects of particulate matter on the lungs are the same whether the source was burned in an electric plant or in a stove at home or in any other way.
Charlie, over to you next.
Thanks. I don't know if this is already on the list or not, but if we're going to bring in folks to talk about air quality that results from McNeil or Rygate, we should invite somebody from McNeil or Rygate to be part of that discussion. Because one thing that I would really like to see is, as we have the discussion, to try to keep it, we won't have to keep it, but make sure part of it looks specifically at these facilities. It's one thing to have a conversation around air quality that results from wood burning in kind of the broad sense. But the more we can focus in on what these facilities are actually doing, whether those are outside experts or folks involved with the facility, but I think that's where our focus should try to land. And then on the questions here that you asked, Pat, the only comment I've got is B and C are a little bit kind of jumbled together and teased apart at the same time. And I might just, keep B as expansion to electric generation. So, more inputs to get more outputs, and then keep C as just physical expansion related to things like district heating. So I think those are kind of the two different focal areas that we're looking at. One is the physical expansion and the impact on, cultural resources or community impacts. And then the other expansion element would be the expansion in electric generation, which would mean more inputs.
I'll clear that up. That's a good point.
Thanks.
Chase.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to build on what Charlie was saying. To the extent that we do ask somebody from, for example, McNeil to come in and speak about the air quality impacts of the McNeil facility, I would encourage this group to also invite a member or two of the communities around McNeil who breathe the air, so that we're getting a more holistic perspective about the impacts. And two, I just note that there are some recent studies, peer-reviewed studies on the impacts of fine particulate matter from burning wood in relation to other sources of electricity generation. And there's the possibility of bringing somebody in from one of those organizations, or from one of those, research groups, the American Lung Association, and other organizations like that have done a lot of work in this space already too.
Chase, do you mind if you have those either contacts or just those sources, can you just shoot them in chat or shoot a note to Marion or me just so we have those?
Yeah, yes, I believe I already sent an email perhaps to Jane. Marion, I think that you're CC'd on this, but I'll circulate that again.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I have it, Chase.
Okay, thanks.
Charlie.
Yeah, sorry, one last quick maybe suggestion would be, it would be helpful also to have somebody with a regulator hat on who can speak, clearly as to who regulates what in this scenario, because I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that there's some state levels and some federal levels here. And as we look at kind of what actions or what's going on with an individual plant, it would be good to know kind of where is the bar set for them and by who and who is regulating that, so that we're clear on terms of, is it a case of the facility is not meeting some benchmark, or is it a case where the benchmark set by something other than the facility is not in the right place, if that helps.
Yeah, Charlie, I can get that information. The Air Quality Division is the has jurisdiction over these facilities. We have construction and operating permits in place for both of them. And we, just for your information, in terms of the federal overlay, all of that Clean Air Act authority is delegated to the state to implement on the federal government's behalf. So that's incorporated into all of our permits, and I can provide those permits to the group, and then also just kind of provide some interpretation from our permitting section as well, if that would be helpful.
Thanks, that'd be great, because I think I kind of foresee some of our recommendations might be around, how are those, what are the permit conditions as opposed to whether or not a facility is meeting those conditions. So that's an important differentiation there.
Yeah, I mean, we collect air quality data, I think that Colin has shared previously with this group, to analyze against facilities permits on an annual basis to kind of check to see if facilities are exceeding their allowed emissions. So, I can say right now that I'm not aware of any enforcement or compliance issues with those two facilities in relation to their permit requirements.
Let's do now. I want to go to Adam, and I want to move on just because of time, because all of our speakers soon. But I think clearly it's going to take more than one meeting to discuss a number of these issues and bring it to sense. Adam.
So yeah, thanks. I think this list of questions is really good, and we'll kind of really cut to the heart of what we're tasked to do. So thank you for framing this up. I guess I had a question similar to Charlie's around where the line is between making recommendations from this committee and ultimately things that are dictated or regulated through the Act 248. Sorry, the 248 certificate of public good for these facilities. So I'm curious to learn more about what we do here and what if ultimately it's really kind of regulated through that.
And Megan can maybe describe some of the regulatory context next time, or if she can find information out for someone to do that. And then we may recommend whatever we recommend, whether it doesn't have the power of law, we're not a formal body, but we certainly can recommend it with rationale to the Climate Council, who then pick it up. But to your point, it may be, some of this is obviously probably outside of our quote unquote jurisdiction. Okay, I want to just
jump in, Pat.
Yeah, Billy.
I think that's why, Adam, in the first set of questions, the focus is on kind of future incentives and expansion, because those are things that there's some discretion related to. And then the second set of questions, I think, is looking at what the regulatory tools are and whether they're adequate, et cetera. So.
Over to you.
I have questions not just about the forest. What about pollutants in the land and the water?
So what we focus, so right now we've got most of our speakers are probably focused on air quality. So Judy, if there are other folks we want to try to talk about potentially other, adverse impacts of those plants in addition to air, we should probably try to find them. What we named so far is primarily air. And we'll work with Megan just to see if in terms of kind of the overall impacts of a plant, how they're regulated by. Okay, and just as we have about 5 minutes left, so this other B is really the broad topic around this question of forest management and we use of woody biomass in any number of places and how we kind of hold, the carbon value of biomass and trying to understand it better. So this is where our presentation last time, we're going to talk about it again in a minute. We also heard from Buchholz before. So, what Jane thought maybe were the questions, is there a consensus on best management practices? What are existing regulatory tools that could be changed or recommended to be changed from this group? Or are there new tools needed to influence procurement? So those were what Jane thought maybe were the more specific questions or frames for this topic, which is, one of our core topics as well. It's a complicated question of trade-offs between, carbon sinks and sequestration, and then use of woody biomass is essentially a tool for, primarily thermal. Any additions or suggestions to those questions?
This may be splitting hairs, Pat, but I think procurement and production. I think production is another element here. So when I think of procurement, I think of where is the woody material coming from a forest setting. But when we think about production, we're thinking about, are we using sawdust residues versus whole tree chips versus XYZ in production.
Got you. Yeah, we may want to, and is that Charlie, this is not my expertise. Is that like materials composition? Is that in part what you mean?
Yeah, essentially. So procurement, I think of in terms of, what is going on, where we're getting the material. So for example, thinking about harvest practices and those kinds of things, or impacts to deer yards or things like those, whereas production gets more at some of the carbon related elements we've been discussing in terms of, if they're 50% semler residue and 30% whole tree chips or whatever, that impacts the carbon calculations. So I think those two things can be teased apart a little bit in terms of recommendations.
And Bill, thanks for joining us. We're just finishing up some scoping, so we'll be with you in probably 5 minutes or less. Judy, do you have your hand up again?
Yeah, I do. I just want to jump into what Charlie is saying. Yeah, also, what needs to be calculated into this is how much fossil fuels is used for drying those green ends and limbs and tops and chips.
Right. I'm just taking notes as we go. Great. Richard and then Chase.
Yeah, I have to apologize, but I'm going to have to leave for a Middlebury Energy Committee meeting shortly. So I'm going to be leaving the meeting. I'll try to listen to the first part of Dr. Keaton's presentation. My perspective on this remains that we need to pay attention to time. How long does it take to replace the carbon that you removed from the forest? Whatever the method was, whether it was chips or chips or tops or whole logs, whatever you're doing, how long does it, and if you burn the biomass, how long does it take to replace it in the forest? That time element I think we need to not lose track of. Thanks.
Yep, it's great. And again, we'll take notes to try to get this in there. Chase, over to you. Chase, you're on mute there.
So sorry, lowered the hand, didn't unmute. I just wanted to point out that one of the key findings in Dr. Buchholz's 2017 paper here, what, as I read it, and as I understand from conversations with Dr. Buchholz, is that the feedstock that's used to actually produce the wood pellets is incredibly important to determining what the greenhouse gas emissions outcomes will be on a life cycle greenhouse gas basis. And if you recall back to his paper, he pulled out a couple of graphs, one of which showed the greenhouse gas emissions from a wood pellet stove relative to oil, other fossil fuels, and to heat pumps. And in that graph, this showed the relative greenhouse gas emissions levels. The assumption was that 50% of the feedstock that was forming those wood pellets was from wood residue. And there was another graph in his paper, the complicated one with all of the different squares, some of which were black and some of which were white. And the key determinant there of greenhouse gas emissions was really the wood residue levels in the wood pellets. And that was determinative of whether or not there'd be a greenhouse gas emissions benefit, whether there'd be a greenhouse gas emissions harm, or whether it'd be neutral. And so as I just read through the points here, it may be that pellet production encompasses considerations of feedstock, but I think that unless we're really calling that out, we might miss it. And that being kind of a key, if not the key, factor that I gleaned from his research anyways. I think we'd be missing the forest for the trees, as it were, if we didn't call out the actual feedstock that's being used. So I would suggest that we add that to the considerations, since it's likely going to be the most important factor for determining greenhouse gas emissions.
We can add the point from Richard about time, to your point, and Charlie's point about kind of production and feedstock and materials. So we'll get those more explicit in there. We have one other section just to look at briefly, but I want to kind of get to Bill. So I'm going to stop sharing here for now. We'll make some edits to this and get this back to you. Richard, I know you'll be kind of double teaming, so thanks for taking the time this morning. So what we want to do is really, Bill, really appreciate you joining us again, is kind of go to that last slide or two you had and really engage in a conversation with the group among itself as much as with you, but also with you as a great expert here. Just think about where the group is on if we were to kind of try to develop some recommendations regarding, in some sense, the scope we just talked about, what might it be? And so we thought it would be good to kind of go through, your kind of propositions and to see where the group is on those, or how they would think about them the same or different. Okay. So, Bill, you might want to just remind us of these pieces here, and might also want to remind us of those 4 tests, and then we'll start diving into a conversation. So thanks for joining us this morning. I appreciate it.
Sure thing. Well, thank you, Patrick, and thanks everyone for inviting me back. So as I understand it, I'm just with you for a half hour to answer questions that you might have, and just to maybe have a little bit of a discussion. So happy to just do this in a free form style. Patrick, can you see my screen right now?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so these were the points that I ended up with last time after a fairly lengthy technical presentation, just trying to collapse everything we've learned from the research that we've done in my lab, at least at UVM, and also work that others have done, just trying to make sense of this very complex and very technical field, very nuanced field. And so at the end of the day, I'm left with the idea that, again, there are trade-offs between all of our choices regarding biomass energy. I think your committee understands that clearly, and it was interesting just now getting just a little snippet of your discussion, to see that you're right on track in terms of understanding trade-offs and nuances. And so what we hope to achieve with this then is to maximize the climate benefits and minimize the risk. I think that's what I started off with last time. Maximize the climate benefits and minimize the risks that there are unintended consequences, the risks that there are unacceptable trade-offs, and the risks that comes along with uncertainty in something like this. So this is what we can do then, what the science seems to indicate that we can do to maximize benefits while minimizing risks. If we favor thermal energy production over electric, that maximizes the efficiency of wood conversion to energy. And then combined heat and power is also an option, so long as thermal is part of that mix. We also know, though, that smaller scale, higher efficiency applications, such as very high efficiency home thermal or municipal, maximize the efficiency of energy generation while minimizing emissions. So that's the second point. But then along with this is the understanding that what happens in the forest is also very important to this equation, both in terms of climate, carbon and climate, but also in terms of the ecology, and the habitat, and the biodiversity, and minimizing risks to some of those important concerns as well. So practicing excellent forestry is a key element of this. And by that, I mean things like maintaining high carbon stocking in our forests and ensuring that we're maintaining key elements of forest structure and composition, habitat that we know is so important for wildlife, for hydrology, for riparian functions, for a whole suite of things. And I'll just comment real quickly on that third point, just to put this into context for you. In the field of forest science, we've come a long way since, let's say, the 1980s in our understanding of what excellent forestry really means. And right up until the sort of reemergence of interest in biomass energy, let's say 10 or 20 years ago, we had made great progress regionally, nationally, internationally, in terms of things like large woody debris retention and retention of dead and dying trees as habitat and other things like this. And now with biomass energy, there's a bit of a trade-off now in terms of where those materials will go. Do we use some of that for energy, or do we leave it in the forest as habitat? So ensuring that we accomplish both is really important. And then finally, I have the 4 tests that I originally proposed and am working on with other groups in the context of durable wood products and mass timber. That's where this comes from. But in preparing my talk for you, it occurred to me that the tests work pretty well for biomass energy as well. And so this is sort of like, again, like what are the standards that we should be thinking about, that we should meet? And the 4 tests, just to recap, let's see if I can remember, that we need to meet are: first, maintaining stable or increasing carbon storage in our forest. And that's a net. So that a net at the landscape scale, which helps us resolve some of those time issues that one of your committee members was talking about a second ago. As long as the net carbon stocking at a large scale remains stable or increasing, that's very important. The second is ensuring that biomass energy complements other natural climate solutions as opposed to conflicts with them. Because remember, we have people working on a whole variety of natural climate solutions, many of which involve forests and other segments of the forest sector are equally as passionate about these other approaches. So we're talking about a portfolio, and we need to make sure that all of those components of the portfolio fit together. The third test is ensuring that we're providing important co-benefits. So things like habitat, open space conservation, incentivizing working forests, working landscapes, riparian functions, hydrology, flood resilience, co-benefits are very important. And then the fourth is just something that we need to be thinking about in all aspects of forest management now, which is that whatever we're doing in the forests and whatever we're doing with wood products and bioenergy, we have to ensure that that helps make our forests future adapted, more resilient to climate, more resilient to disturbance, future adapted. So that's a key element of this. So those are my 4 tests. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and we can just open it up for questions.
Great. So I think if there's questions for Bill about any of those kind of propositions or approaches, things that you think are missing or that or would want to add, just curious. So Charlie, over to you.
Thanks. Probably a complex answer, but I don't know if you have a simple one for it, Bill. But when we think about maintaining stable or increased net carbon storage, when we think about net is the result of change, and change happens on a time frame. Is there a time frame that generally you're thinking about when you say that? Because I could see, there's the net change this year, the net change this decade, the net change this 50 years. So how should we think about that?
Right. Well, let me see if I can go back to a slide that might help us with this. So the key is understanding it at this landscape scale. So yes, there's change. Like, change is constant. It's always happening. But with forests, as you know, it tends to happen at different spatial scales. We have change at sort of patch scales, at stand scales, sometimes larger disturbances that affect big areas. But if we're thinking about the sort of the net effects of what's happening across all of those stands, all that collection of stands, what we want to make sure, can you see my cursor if I move it around like this? You can, okay. We want to make sure that we don't lower that net carbon storage by intensifying harvests, in integrated harvests that include wood energy. So as long as the net effect remains either here or maybe even higher, if we practice carbon forestry techniques, for example, then we can be assured that we're not fluxing significant amounts of carbon off the landscape, which would have to count against the energy benefits and the substitution benefits of wood energy, right? So we're accommodating change by thinking of that at the stand scale. So stands are changing and fluctuating, but if they balance out, if the equilibrium effect at very large scales is stable or increasing, we're good. Now, of course, this does not account for the opportunity cost. That's one of those baselines that we talked about, right? Like, what if we'd done something else? What if we'd chosen a different natural climate solution or a different way of managing our forests? Might that alternative have increased carbon stocks on the landscape even further? And so some stress that opportunity cost and see that as a concern with bioenergy. But we don't have to get too bogged down with that again today. We understand that there are different baselines and different ways of doing the carbon accounting. But anyway, that's what I'm talking about in terms of stable or increasing. Does that make sense, Charlie?
Yeah, I think so. I think the way I take that is that essentially, rather than saying we're looking at net stability from time 0 to time X, we're looking at a moment in time in relation to these broader fluctuations. And if our moment in time is essentially in that sweet spot, then we're maintaining that net. Is that kind of a correct summation?
That is. I mean,
Okay.
You could look at it, but we would have to look at it at multiple moments of time, obviously, tracking this over decades.
Yep. But it's not something where we're saying we've got between now and Tuesday or now and 2025 to kind of come back down to that spot. It's happening in real time, and so we're tracking it against where we are.
Right.
Yeah.
Although climate scientists, of course, will remind us that we've got about a decade or maybe less to get this right. And so
as far as impacts go,
right. And so, like, if the unintended consequence of any policy decision is that we flux a lot of carbon to the atmosphere in the next 10 years, it doesn't matter if we recoup that in 50 or 100 years, because the effect on the climate at that point may be irreversible or may require centuries to recover from. So that's why we got to get it right in the next 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, impact versus how are we actually measuring it from
right.
That's your chart. Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Judy, over to you.
Sorry, I want to understand net a little better. Are we talking net in one plot of land that is being harvested over and over? Are we talking net throughout the state?
Well, we're talking about net at landscape scales. So that could be at the state level. You could track it that way, certainly. You could track it regionally. You could use various other sort of ecological units like watersheds. Ecologists think of landscapes in a variety of ways, but the fundamental idea is that we're tracking it as a collection of forest stands. So not individual plots, not individual stands, because we understand that their carbon stocking will fluctuate over time as we harvest and manage them. Sometimes, very importantly, we need to do this, and for other reasons, but also because of natural disturbances like wind, fire, insects, pathogens. So we need to track it across collections of stands.
Okay, thank you.
Bill, I want to, there's a question in chat, but it occurred to me too, so I want to raise. So like, given that like over time, if you harvest in the right way, you can maintain this kind of like positive sort of sequestration or storage effect over long periods of time, as long as you kind of get the harvesting levels and the kind right. But as you pointed out, in the next decade, we are kind of pressed for time, quote unquote. So does that suggest we just should not do any biomass in the next 10 years and wait till later when we have more time to recoup? Or does it just suggest we should be careful about not intensifying because of the next 10 years necessity and kind of imperative? Just give us a sense of that because of that time scale you mentioned.
Yeah, I always want to be careful when I'm asked a really direct question like that, like what should we do? Because my job is to lay out the scientific consequences of different policy alternatives that you're considering. But I would say one very important option is to, yes, ensure that we don't intensify our harvests over current levels, or that if we are using wood biomass energy, that we're doing that very carefully. That is a way of ensuring that we don't unwittingly reduce net carbon storage over the next decade. Yes, so trying to avoid over intensification of harvests.
Great.
But again, yeah, okay, I'll leave it at that.
No, that's good. And again, you're always free enough to not answer my direct questions too. So no problem. I thought, Adam, I thought you had your hand up, and then Billy.
Hi, Bill. Thanks for joining us. My question is regarding like FIA data, and could you just speak very high level to the growth to removal ratio in Vermont and how that looks and how that plays into what you were just saying? I think that's a simpler kind of lens to break it down.
Yeah, my screen just froze up. I was going to show you a slide that there we go. So, so FIA data are very useful, obviously, for anything like this, as is remotely sensed data. And, I think we're going to see a shift in the next 10 or 20 years to carbon monitoring using remote sensing techniques, both drones and satellite imagery. But of course, that complements field-based measurements like FIA data. So these are our FIA data for Vermont. And in fact, they do show that we have had and currently have stable or increasing carbon storage with the level of forest harvesting that we have now. So that's good news. That's good news, to the extent that we have biomass energy as part of this mix. And as you all know, that is a part of many integrated harvests. These data suggest that we're doing a pretty good job. I will say that others have worked the FIA data in other ways, and I'd have to dig into it a little bit to really explain why they've reached different conclusions. But Charlie Canham, for example, who's a very well-known scientist at the Carey Institute for Environmental Studies in Millbrook, New York, and really an expert on big data analysis using FIA data. And he's worked with Thomas Buchholz, who you've been, referencing. They have a different report that they did for New England. Maybe the difference is that they included New York, New Hampshire, Maine, but they were showing actually declining stocks, at least regionally, with current forest harvest levels, again, using FIA data. So there's some difference of opinion in terms of what the data are showing, but at least the slide I'm showing you here from Vermont's carbon assessment suggests that maybe in Vermont, we're doing it well.
Adam, any follow-up to that before I go to Billy?
Thanks, that's really helpful.
That's good. Billy.
Thanks. I was just responding, Pat, to your last question. And I think we have to be very careful when we ask questions like that. Going back to Dr. Keaton's first statement of being mindful of unintended consequences in the policy decisions that we make, that we're not looking solely at the direct emissions associated with the harvesting of wood fuel and the use of it. There's also the impacts on land stewardship and ownership patterns and land conversion that could have a significantly more impactful result on our net emissions if we get that wrong. So if we disincentivize the long-term stewardship of land in a forested state, and that results in conversion to homes or other things, we're not only losing the carbon above ground, we're releasing significant underground stocks, and the outcome could be even worse. So I think we need to just keep the full picture in mind when you're asking questions like that.
And Bill, I think
absolutely, and that's key in terms of like that other argument here that bioenergy, just like all forms of kind of sustainable forest management incentivize working forests. And at the end of the day, keeping things as forests, not as lawns and driveways, is probably the best thing that we can do from a climate standpoint.
Right.
Because we are losing forest cover in Vermont, as we are in all of New England.
Other questions for Bill about kind of the findings, the 4 tests? And I tried to put those in chat just so we had them in front of us, but other questions for Bill, just for understanding and the like.
I'd like to respond to one of the chat comments. Bill, how about regeneration issues due to deer browse? So yes, like these are cross-cutting issues, you know, that are of concern to all aspects of sustainable forestry. So you know, ungulate browse, both deer and moose, the beech bark disease, and the sort of the beech thickets that we have that in some cases that are inhibiting regeneration of anything else, and that in some places we're seeing are leading to sort of a collapse of the forest into a new condition, sort of a beech hell stasis that has very low carbon value. You know, exotic earthworms, acid deposition in some places that reduces sugar maple success, other insects on the horizon like Asian longhorn beetle. And, you know, there's so many of these concerns that threaten long-term sustainability in our forests, but those are not specific to wood bioenergy. They are relevant to all aspects of forest management.
Bill, one question to follow up on Billy's point, and I'll go to Judy, is that has there been any studies or modeling to show that kind of complicated trade-off between, you know, okay, so you don't want to harvest too much because you might lower carbon stocks, but if you don't harvest enough and you don't have income to woodlot owners, they may have a disincentive. They may not have enough income, they may have to sell, and so you see land conversion increase. So is anybody kind of trying to study those interactions in a modeled way so we can kind of look at those the trade-offs?
I think the answer to that question is yes. I mean, certainly carbon markets have explored this, you know, thoroughly, and so the idea of, you know, selling emissions offsets as a way to add revenue to working forests, you know, it hasn't just been shown in the literature, like it is being used as a way to incentivize working forests and to conserve forests across the country. So there's an example of using carbon basically as a conservation tool. There is also good literature kind of specific to the Northeast that shows that the more we can layer different incentives and revenue streams, and that includes, you know, like market-based revenue, like the sale of wood products and wood energy, but also tax burden relief through, you know, current value, cost share programs like, you know, WIP and EQIP, easements, all of these things. The savvy landowner will layer all of these revenue streams, and that helps keep working forests in business. And so, yes, we know that this is true.
Judy, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. I have a couple questions. One is a comment that Cheryl made in the chat. One of the things we discovered at Ag and Ecosystems was that the Green Mountain Forest was cutting down tens of thousands of trees, and that there was not a representative on any of the subcommittees or the Climate Council from the Green Mountain Forest. And so there seemed to be this lack of communication between the state and Green Mountain Forest and what they were cutting down. Do you know of any communication between the two agencies? And do you know how the figures you've given us is going to be impacted by the destruction of those trees? That's my first question. Do you want to answer that one first, or?
Yeah, I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question, Judy. I haven't been privy to those conversations or discussions. So yeah, I have no knowledge that you know I can use to answer that question. Sorry, can't help with that one.
Okay, and my second question, your chart said our forest store or your slide said our forest stores 480 million metric tons of carbon. We received a chart from Colin telling us that McNeil alone emits 503,000 million metric tons of carbon a year. So if that's happening at McNeil and roughly half of that is happening at Reigate, how can you say we're in relatively good shape in Vermont?
Well, I wasn't including, there's nothing in that slide about emissions. You know, we emit greenhouse gases from all kinds of different sources. That slide was just simply showing you how much carbon Vermont's forests store, like what's in
Right.
what's in the forest, and it's showing you that at least currently we're not reducing the amount that they store. In fact, they seem to be sequestering and accumulating more carbon. So the amount of carbon their storage is increasing over time. This is just important because from a forest management standpoint, what we want to make sure we don't do is significantly reduce the amount of carbon that's stored in forests. That's the only point there. But understanding the emissions side of the equation is, as you say, is critically important.
Correct. And that's why I was asking, how can you say we're in good shape? Because
Yeah,
you have to consider that
Right.
other side.
I'll be very careful and qualify that. I meant specifically in terms of the amount of carbon that our forests store.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bill. Other questions for Bill about any of the slides, any of the kind of the background to the kind of the points that he put forward here? Any other questions for Bill? So we get to our 30-minute time frame here. Yeah, Charlie.
Thanks. Yeah, just going back to your last visit with us, there was a question right towards the end and we kind of ran out of time, but it had to do with, I think it was the impacts of land conversion, you know, forest to non-forest versus harvesting and the impacts on carbon stocks. I think you remember, I can't remember the paper that was being pointed to, but I think the assertion was that harvesting actually has a greater impact on our carbon storage, net carbon storage, than land conversion does. I didn't know if since then you'd had a chance to consider that or.
Oh, I don't think I said that, Charlie. That doesn't.
Oh, no, I don't think
Yeah.
you did. I think it was,
Oh, someone.
Yeah, it was a point that was brought up by, I think, one of our visitors in relation to a paper that was put out, and I can't remember who the author was. I just didn't know if that was something that after that conversation with us, you had a chance to look at.
I do vaguely remember this. Yes, it was one of the Harvard Forest papers. Duvenak was the paper that I was pointed towards, and no, I haven't had a chance to look at it. I should, and I can follow up with you by email.
That's cool.
Bill, that would be. And Charlie, can you just state the question again one more time, just so I
the question was just in relation to the paper that was cited, and I think the assertion was that, you know, based on the paper, it shows that essentially timber harvesting is more detrimental to the carbon picture than land conversion is was the takeaway that was being put forward, and I just wasn't sure if.
Yeah. And I'll just say I'm incredibly skeptical of that point. I have a feeling that the paper is maybe showing something slightly different. So
okay,
I'd be very skeptical of that assertion. It doesn't make sense just mathematically, you know. Okay. Yeah.
And Bill, if you don't mind just flying up the email, you can Charlie shoot it to Jane, and then we can share it with the group. That'd be really terrific. Thanks for that.
Sure.
We really appreciate the time and your expertise. Other questions for Bill as we begin to wrap his piece? Anything else? Bill, really appreciate the presentation a few weeks ago, coming back today to clarify some things, and appreciate that. And you know, we may come back to you yet again. So
my pleasure. Anytime. Okay, thanks very much. Best of luck with your work. Okay, bye.
So again, this is just for conversation. So one is, I think, before we leave this conversation, just to come back to scope and then public comment before end of today, I want to just figure out if there's other folks who you want to present on these topics. And I think we had one or two that were suggested last time, but if there's other folks, like Billy's point, I wonder if we need to think about what economists we might want to bring in for this kind of complicated question. And maybe it's even related to the land conversion versus harvesting point, Charlie, you made. But I'm curious, when you look at these propositions that Bill put forward, and then these kind of 4 tests that that goes with them, I'm just curious which of these things you disagree with. Either I don't know, or like I disagree with that statement. I'm just curious to what degree these things would represent potentially, you know, a sense of the group, or whether there's actually disagreement about them. So we're not trying to get to an answer today. We just kind of want to see where these propositions sit with you all.
So are you asking about Bill's 4 tests, or as it relates to
the whole
scope of
thing?
work?
He's got his propositions, right? Favor thermal and combined over electricity, small scale efficient, you know, good
Gotcha.
forestry, and ensure production meets those 4 key tests, which then brings in the 4 key tests. So I'm just curious what you all think about, agree, disagree, have questions about those propositions. And then I put them in chat so people would have them in writing. Curious what you all think.
Yeah,
Billy, go for
I
it.
agree with those. I think the reason we're here is because we have existing consumers of wood energy that don't necessarily nest in those categories, and we're talking about our position on those. So, but sure, I certainly agree with those.
Yeah, I completely agree with them. I think my hang up gets into like, okay, now what? What do we do with that?
Right.
You know, some of these are kind of complex, you know, like practice excellent forestry that maintains high carbon stocking. I'm all for that. The question is, how do you legislate good forestry? You know, at what point can you regulate to, you know, so.
And that was something in Jane's questions we put down, is like, what specifically could we recommend around, say, number 3 of Bill's points? Because like you said, it's pretty general. Other thoughts or comments on Bill's recommendations?
I have some comments. One, I just put in the chat in relation to what Charlie just said. How do you even determine what is good forestry practices? I also have, I want to understand more about net. He keeps saying we'll have net, we'll have net. I would rather see an increase than let's be equal on anything. I mean, we're in a crisis here. We can't just live our lives at net.
That's right. So his comment is for what is forecast is maintain stable or increasing net carbon storage. I think, Judy, you'd say we should just focus on the increasing net carbon storage.
Yeah, at this point, because he said the next 10 years are critical because it takes so long for forests to reclaim. So everything we do in the next 10 years should, in my mind, should be increasing.
Other thoughts to Bill's kind of propositions and 4 tests here that people have, you know, views of one way or the other. Sorry for the barking dog. So it seems like, again, we might discuss kind of the stable versus net increase. It seems like number 3, which is we already kind of know, 3 is that number 3 of his is where we really are going to have to dig in to talk about what does that actually mean? What tools do you have or not have? So I think what I'm hearing so far from the group is, in general, yes, with some caveats, these look plausible, but 3, we really have to see about what we actually mean there.
Pat, I'm interested how these relate to the scope that we just defined as a group. Some of these seem like they may be out of scope, so it'd be helpful for you to help at some point me understand how his points align with the scope that we just agreed to.
I mean, I think it's a good question. So I think in regard to the kind of scope part 2 of our scope, which is around this complicated question of use of woody biomass for thermal and electricity, which our scope includes for that one both, and forest stocks, how do you kind of put it all together? So I think a lot of this relates to that. I mean, how much we want to say favor small scale high efficiency, is that in our scope? I don't know. I think number 3 of his points definitely is. 1, maybe because it's related to McNeil and Rye, I don't know. And then 4, we'd have to look through those 4 tests to see how much of them are relevant to what we're trying to do. So that's just a first quick guess. I think I think in our scope, kind of what I'll call 2, we're really trying to understand this complex story between, woody biomass as fuel and woody biomass as, sort of storage, sequestration, and other co-benefits. And as to Charlie's point, is what specifically can we even recommend regarding that? It's such a complicated story and there are limited tools. Other thoughts about, Liz, I don't know if you have any kind of reflections or thoughts on these so far.
No, nothing that hasn't already been captured. I think we're good.
Megan, how about yourself? Megan, how about yourself?
Nope, nothing else for me. Thanks, Pat.
Good. Okay.
I have one more comment, Patrick. Ensure our forests are future adapted, resilient to changing climate. Don't we have to do something? I mean, we can work on our forests, but we have to change to make our forests that resilient.
You could say ensure our forests and our forest managers, owners, etc.
Or we could say people need to get off their asses and work on this. Because that's the issue. People aren't. I mean, it's been almost a year we brought up the fact that nobody's communicating with Green Mountain Forest. And we still don't have that communication.
Two questions, two different things. So one is, I think, in the Ag and Eco group on number 4, you all did work on thinking about resilient adaptive forests. So I think some of your recommendations are related to number 4. I'm not sure that's actually within this, Billy, to your point, I'm not sure that one's really in our scope, but it is in the Ag and Eco scope. And then to your point about Green Mountain Forest, and it came up in the chat too, when we talk about forestry practices, that's obviously federal, but how we kind of engage with them, I think we'll just have to think about as a group. And whether we want to get to that level of kind of unit or discussion.
I can't remember the number, but it was huge. It was like they were going to cut down 40,000 trees or 40,000 acres or something like that. It was a lot of trees. And it just seems like if we have this goal and they are counter to our goal, communication has to happen there.
Charlie, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I think if we're going to dig into that, it would make sense to bring in somebody from the Forest Service to talk about what their harvest plans are, because I think yes, I think big picture, they are increasing the projected level of harvest in their new management plan. But when you get into what they're doing, it's a little more nuanced than, clear cutting X number of acres. But I think to Judy's broader point, there is something to be looked at here in terms of if we're looking at statewide or regional carbon stocks, those are part of that bucket. I just think it's, when it comes to the Green Mountain National Forest, it's a really hot topic right now. If anyone's been to any of their public meetings around it, it's pretty heated, to be honest. And so I just want to make sure that if we get into that, we're getting into it from a place of understanding versus projecting onto it.
Well, we're living in the middle of a pretty hot topic, and it's hotter.
I agree. I agree completely, Judy. Yeah. It's again, it's going back to these things where if we're going to dig into certain aspects of it, as Judy was saying, I think we should invite people in if we're going to talk about it, as opposed to just talk about it from the outside.
Good. And again, we'll have to decide whether we want to go down to that level of scale in terms of a unit of forest versus talk more broadly, but clearly, the Green Mountain is a part of the story. And Billy, to your point too about scope, I think on maintaining stable, increasing net carbon storage, in some ways, that was also some of the recommendations of the Ag and Eco group, was trying to keep, forest in forest, right? So I think the Ag and Eco group more broadly tried to put forward recommendations on some of what is in one of Bill's first of 4 tests. Billy, is that correct? All right, so part of we want to have this discussion is Jane and I are just thinking about how we can begin to draft propositions, early recommendations that the group might think make sense to forward back to the Climate Council, and keeping track of those as we go, though we have a lot more to learn, just so people are beginning to feel like we're building towards something, to our conversation last time about making sure we're ending up somewhere. So any other comments about Bill's presentation, propositions, anything else for now? I guess what I want to close with on this piece is what are, we're going to cover a lot of air quality issues broadly and specifically with the two facilities next meeting. But in July, we're going to need to cover probably some of these broader, kind of questions around good forestry, quote unquote, that Charlie raised. So I'm wondering if there's any other folks you can think of as presenters we want to start teeing up for July. Anybody in particular that we want to bring in to help us see what else we can say about particularly that, that proposition, whatever that was of Bill's, which is the, number 3 is practice forestry that maintains carbon stocking and stand structure. And obviously some of you in the room have a lot of experience in this already, but I'm curious other folks who are thinking about would be helpful. Anybody coming to mind?
So we've talked about bringing in actual folks from McNeil or Reigate to talk about some of the air quality things, but it might be interesting to have them talk about their procurement standards that they work under as well. Because we've talked about, it's been pointed out multiple times, look at what's in their yard from this photo or whatever. But if we understood a little bit more in terms of what are they getting, where is it coming from, what are the standards they're operating under, that would be beneficial, because if we're going to make any kind of recommendations to tweak those or change them, if we have a baseline to work from, that would be important.
Yep. Okay. So
it would also be important to find out how much fossil fuel they use to operate that facility.
Sure. I think any questions related to the facility, I think we should probably tee up a list for them. But I just think those are those things where I think we should have someone in here from the facility to talk. And I think if we have a list of questions related to anything like this, it'd be good to have those in hand.
So why don't we do this? Why don't we try to build a list of questions that people might have for McNeil? Charlie, you already gave us a good beginning list, I think, and then Jane can explore, not next time, but sometime soon, whether we can invite them in. I think the key will be, we don't want to put them on the defensive. We want information and facts, and we'd ask everyone to be respectful, even if you strongly disagree with the facility. And then when we send them off on their way, we can debate it all we want, right? I would just encourage us to kind of handle them in a way that we're getting information from them, and then we can debate that afterwards when they're not on the call. So, but with that caveat, I think what we can do is if people want to start sending, me or Marion or Jane, just kind of questions you might have if we invited a McNeil representative in, that would be helpful. And Billy, Charlie, you've given us the beginning of a list. All right.
In terms of your recommended speakers, I think listening to this conversation, where my mind goes is what motivates Vermont is 4.5 million acres of forest land, and 86% of it is privately owned. There is a researcher with the U.S. Forest Service, Brett Butler is a PhD, and he does a national woodland owners survey that looks at kind of the objectives and motivations of private landowners and what they're managing for, what drives those choices. And so as we're looking at these issues, understanding the mindset of private forest land owners, I think would be enrich our thinking about these issues.
Is he based in Vermont, Adam?
He's based in Massachusetts, but his survey covers the entire Northeast. So, we've talked about it from the facility side, and we've talked about it from the forest manager side. But, if we have such a large percentage of the managed land base in privately owned land ownership, I think he would add some insights to the conversation.
Okay. Any other thoughts like that before we close this piece? Okay, I want to pull back up the rest of our scope here because we didn't cover part 3. So I want to kind of do that. Bear with me.
Hey, Patrick.
Yeah.
It's Liz, sorry. Just looking at the agenda, I've said this in other meetings and before, I feel pretty strongly we should do public comment when we say we are going to do public comment. So I want to just put a plug in for making sure that happens.
And we said 9:50. We got 3 minutes. I think that makes
Perfect.
So, and let's keep me honest. I think that's good. Okay, so we have 3 minutes. Looking quickly at this piece here, this is like the program of education and outreach. And so Jane framed up 3 questions. What are existing technical assistance and educational programs that influence forest management? How can these programs speak to harvesting of trees for biomass in a way that is informed by science? What are key messages we would want to include? It's titled a little bit, part of what we talked about already. So again, people, why don't you look at those 3, shoot Jane or Marion or I any suggestions for additions or changes to those questions for part 3. And then we'll send out a revised document before our next meeting in terms of this document and kind of the scoping. And we've got some other changes to above.
Can you,
Yeah, Jane, Judy, go for it.
can you put a link to this document in the chat box, please?
Yeah, I think, Marion, can you do that? Is that okay?
Yes, I can do that. Give me a minute.
Great, thanks a lot. So hang tight, we'll get it in there.
Because I think right off the bat, we should have TEK in those questions.
Okay, that's in that part 3. I'm just going to note that. Okay. And Judy, if you can think about how to frame up that question, that'd be great. But I'm just going to note we need to add it. So, okay. Okay. There's the link. Thank you, Marion. All right. Public comment. Just raise your hand, and then we'll just call on you one at a time. Cheryl, over to you first.
Hi, everybody. Liz, thank you very much. I would like to point out that I did put it in the chat, but I just want to say it so everybody thinks about it, that the issues, the other impacts on forests, including issues with regeneration, do matter, because if the forest doesn't regenerate, so including, deer browse, invasive insects, climate change, etc. If the forest isn't regenerating like we think it's going to, we're not going to have that net stasis that we want on carbon. So that's one thing. Another thing, well, I guess I was going to say this, but Charlie, you brought it up, so thank you. That was the logging impact on forest equal to fragmentation from rural sprawl and that kind of thing. So there's not just one, I don't have on the top of my head the studies that say it, but there's at least a couple out there on that. I'm going to let somebody else comment and remember what my other point was. Sorry about that.
No problem, Cheryl. No problem at all. Other public comment, just raise your hand. Anybody else want to make a public comment right now? All right, Cheryl, tried to buy you time, but I'm not sure I was able to. Do you know what your third point might be?
Yeah, it was, oh my God.
Your time. Okay, we have a little time.
Yep, I'll get back to you. I'll just raise my hand when I think of it, because you've got a couple of minutes.
Okay. So just as I name action items, I think we've heard of. Marion, please fill in here. We've kind of assembled a list of potential speakers. So we've got a number of folks around air quality. We'll try to track down a number of those folks. It's been requested that we invite McNeil in and develop a set of questions for them. We'll cover a range of topics. So we'll do that. We're going to modify this document as suggested, including TEK and some changes to the one above. And then Jane and I will continue to think about how we kind of start drafting some of this in just like very, very early kind of propositions that you all are, going to potentially then forward, keeping in mind kind of what's in scope, what's on edge of scope, and what's outside of scope as well. And I think on the kind of the notion of the economics of landowners and stuff, Rhett Butler maybe is suggested by Adam, maybe others, we can be thinking about that as well. So those are and then I'll also, that's right. And then Green Mountain Forest we need to put on the list too, thanks. And there was also a UMass Lowell researcher that's on our list from last time we needed to track down too. Cheryl, back to you.
Right, just took me a second, and your word, scope. So one thing I really question the scope itself, because when you're this biomass task group, you're talking about using the biomass for whatever it's used for. And I really do think one thing that Bill did point out is that it shouldn't be just for energy. It should be combined or heat. That was in one of his lists on his one list. But scope, I don't know how you can talk about biomass and really leave some things out. You really kind of just need to talk about all the issues about using biomass. You can't just leave out the impacts to biodiversity or the air, well, you're not going to leave out the air quality, and all of the impacts, because it's not just that you're going to only talk about, it's only going to do one thing. You just have to talk about all the impacts. Reducing the scope to not talk about some of the impacts from biomass use is not logical. Additionally, with well, I'm not going to talk about the biofuels thing, but I think you're making a great mistake, because one of the things that using biofuels, even the other kinds of biofuels, is going to greatly impact biomass. It's going to impact the forests, which the reason for talking about biomass use is because it impacts the forest. So, you know, A equals B, B equals C, A equals C. And it's going to be too late if you miss that biofuel talk. And I know that the steering committee, I was there at the steering committee meeting, and I know that they talked about it, not dealing with it until after whatever comes through, after a year or whatever, but it's going to be too late by then. And we really don't have time. I also want to bring up a missing point. I don't know who wrote up the main takeaways from Bill's talk, but I had a bunch of other takeaways from his talk that are not on that list. And one of which is, I'd love to share my screen. Can I do that for a second?
Sure, Cheryl, be brief, but go for it.
Very brief. Where is it? Here we go. See it?
There we go. It's coming up now. Yeah.
Okay. Well, take a look at this one. No management. Look at the carbon. I mean, if we really, really want to deal with carbon, both storage and sequestration, both, that's what we do. No management. I mean, that's a huge takeaway, but so don't forget that. And I know there are, that's it, I guess, for me.
Oh, great, Cheryl. Thank you so much. Charlie, over to you, and then we're about probably close to time. But
yeah, I just want to say to Cheryl's last point, it's an interesting metric to look at, but I mean, when we talk about co-benefits and everything, the no management scenario, I mean, it's a nice baseline to use, but to put forward a recommendation that we just walk away from our forests, I think is, for me, a non-starter. I mean, I can see in everybody's Zoom screens, there's wood, right? Like, I mean, like, we use forest products. So I think our job is to figure out how do we get how we're managing our forests to that point where we need to, and not simply just stop cutting them.
Absolutely. Yep, I agree with that. But I mean, that's an important conversation. That's what we're supposed to be having here, right? Okay.
And again, I think, given our time, we can't explore every co-benefit or impact of what we're talking about, but we certainly can at least mention them. So at least that. So Annette, over to you.
Yes, on that topic, I think that, this whole discussion has been quite a very good education for me. And one of the things that I have come to realize in the last year or two is how embedded logging is in so much state and federal policy. And so what we're not seeing is lands that are set aside to not be logged. And we have very little wilderness. We have just this overwhelming policy that we got to log. Now, the change in the use value appraisal program is a step forward. I actually have land and use value appraisal that is so incredibly challenging to log. You have to cross a brook. There are two streams. It's steep. It is full of water. It is exactly the sort of thing that should be left alone. And so what I'm looking at is not to say, let's stop logging, but let's change the paradigm so that what we're doing is allowing more forests to grow old and allowing more of the areas that have extraordinary, or not even extraordinary, but actual biodiversity and water value, wildlife value, to get away from this mindset that everything has to be logged. And I say that from the perspective of someone who has been in the woodworking business, who understands the beauty of wood and the value of wood. But this idea that all forests have to be logged that's really where we are in Vermont right now. And so what I'd like to see as a potential is not to say what Charlie said was, just stop all logging, but to really reframe the whole discussion around what's appropriate and to leave areas that are not required or necessary to be logged, because that's what our planet needs right now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Okay, we're about at time. Again, we're going to try to track down some of these other experts that people noted, but in the short term, we're trying to get our conversation squared away for the 29th. So we'll reach back to Megan and Mary and I will email to try to figure out how we get those folks kind of squared away as the right kind of people to cover that conversation. And then if you all want to send us questions that you might want for McNeil, that will be helpful to begin to assemble those if we could. And then any further comments just on kind of the questions in the scope as described. Okay. Marion, is there anything else that you heard or can think of that you want to name?
No, nothing for me.
Okay. Anything from the working group as a whole? Anything else today? Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate. We'll keep moving this forward and try to continue to see if we can find some progress by September. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.